some assembly required. I'd like to share with you today some thoughts I have on making and unmaking and remaking. When I first came to this school, I noticed a plaque on the wall, and it was quoting someone named Comenius. Comenius. I was new here, I was new to the Czech Republic, and so I looked him up. Jan Amos Comenius, Jan Amos Komensky in Czech, was a 17th century philosopher who wrote a lot. I mean, they all did in those days. But one of the things he wrote about was how we could make schools and learning better. And I apologize for this wall of text, but these words are important and have become important to me. So I want to share them with you. Craftsmen do not hold their apprentices down to theories. They put them to work without delay. Therefore, in schools, let the pupils learn to write by writing, to speak by speaking, so that schools may simply be workshops in which work is done eagerly. Thus, all will feel at last the truth of this proverb, fabricando, fabricamur. In making, we are made. Fabricando, fabricamur. So way back in the 17th century, here's Comenius saying kids would learn better with fewer theories and more practice making things. Do you remember the first time you tried to tie your shoes? It wasn't easy, right? Did someone explain to you a theory about how to do it? No, you learned it with practice. And it wasn't easy. I mean, you had to get the ends even, and you're wrapping around the loop, or maybe you learned the bunny ears method, but some of the time it came undone, right? You had to start again. But eventually, you learn how to do it. It becomes easy. You don't even have to think about it. You just tie your shoes and you go right out into the world. You're all set. And I want to think today about that learning by doing. Because I think I learn better that way. And I bet you do too. Learning by making things. Because I believe profoundly that we are all makers. Now, I mean, some people are going to say, maybe not. But no, I mean, maybe you're the person who makes cookies for your friends. Maybe you're the person who can take a piece of paper and turn it into the most glorious music. Maybe you're just the person who makes a lot of bad jokes. We are all makers. And so, looking back at Comenius, fabricando, fabricamur, he says, in making we are made, but we could translate that as in making, we make ourselves. And so I'm really grateful. I think, okay, this gives me permission to imagine that all this stuff that I make, all of this, these mess, this projects, all of that, see, this is important. I'm making myself. And then I begin to think back about the fact that so many of those projects are unfinished, right? And so then I begin to wonder, what does that handmade self look like? I mean, if this stuff is unfinished, I mean, am I like Marley's ghost walking through the world, trailing bits of unraveling knitting and unfinished electronics projects and broken mechanical toys and small wooden beads dropping all over the place? I mean, it's a mess. Or maybe each of those things I make gets added to me, added to the sense of self, so that gradually I accumulate these different completed projects, and I become this swollen, lumpy mass of stuff until I'm complete. Or dead, I suppose. And all of these completed projects become that permanent record they warned me about when I was in school. I don't know. I think maybe I'd rather think about making as continuous instead of cumulative, right? Because we could also translate Comenius as saying, not just in making, but in the process of making, we make ourselves. In the process of making. In these kinds of decisions, these activities we engage in when we are making things and remaking things, that's the process that creates who we are in the world. So to tell you a little bit about me, I'm a knitter, among other things, and I had this beautiful Japanese yarn. It was greens and blues, it's part wool, part silk. It gradually changed colors, and so I began to make a sweater. And I started knitting at the cuff of one sleeve, and I began knitting towards the elbow, looking at the colors appear under my hands as I'm knitting. And I knit, and I knit. And I don't know, maybe a week went by. I'm not a very fast knitter. And I get to a point, and I look at it, and I realize it's kind of boring. That what had been so beautiful in those balls of wool is just not the color, the contrast isn't there, it's just kind of drab. And so I tried going a little further, and then I just gave up. I unraveled that sleeve all the way back to the cuff, and I began knitting it again, only this time in stripes. I took some from one ball of yarn, some from another ball of yarn, and this color still changed gradually, but the contrast was there. It was more interesting. I couldn't wait to see what the next combination of stripes looked like, and so I kept knitting, and I enjoyed the process. And someone said to me, well, wasn't that annoying? To get all the way through a sleeve, only to rip it all out again? And I had to explain to them, that's not the point for me. For me, knitting is this chance in my life where I can play with color and with texture. And it's about the process. So I don't care. As a matter of fact, the longer the knitting takes, the happier I am with it, right? The more entertainment I'm getting out of that same purchase of yarn. So for me with knitting, the joy is in the process, not the accumulation of the thing that gets made. And so I want to look back at this idea from Comenius, this idea I've borrowed from him, that we keep making and unmaking and remaking ourselves and our lives all the time. Assembly is always required. And I can tell you something about that. Because this is an important person. This is my mother. And growing up in the 1940s and 1950s, she loved art. But she was very practical and very hardworking and very smart. And she met my father, and they had 5 children. And he was a college professor, and she raised us. And then she began working as a research scientist, part-time when we were little, full-time as we got older. And she was really a groundbreaker in the field. And I think she really enjoyed the work. But when that last college tuition was paid, 5 children, remember, and the last child had graduated, my mother left science and went to art school. And she did a 4-year program in really conceptual contemporary art. And then she got a 5th-year fellowship, and she keeps working. And on her she was in her late 50s and early 60s doing this stuff. And on her 71st birthday, there she was on a genie high lift, installing a commissioned sculpture at Tufts University in the United States. And at 85, she's still making art. I know, inspiring. Making and remaking. But looking back, I realize what we've learned from her, what we, her 5 children, have learned from this process. We have learned that you can take these good pieces of a life you've made, thinking you were on one particular path, and you can rearrange them. You can reassemble these things you know how to do, these skills, these experiences, these aptitudes. You can rearrange them when you want to go in another direction. And you can do this again, and you can do this again. And people may look at you and say, she's making a mess. Look, her shoes are untied, right? She unraveled that whole sleeve of the sweater. And yeah, she left that apparent career and went to do something else. And so I want to say to you, trust Comenius. Trust your making. Know that some assembly is always required. Fabricando, fabricamur. And we are always in the process of becoming our truer selves.